Welcome to Blender Cinematic. I've been able to pull off complex destruction simulations in Blender using RBDLab add-on, and I also started uploading relevant tutorials on this channel. Please take a look. For basic tutorials on this add-on, please visit the RBDLab official YouTube channel. The most important videos are fracture module, physics module, mesh visualization options, and the constraints module. If you'd like to purchase the RBDLab add-on and support the channel at the same time, please use the affiliate link in the description below, which allows us to receive a commission at no additional cost to you. Thank you. In this tutorial, let's take the manifold building that we prepared for destruction in our previous tutorial, and let's see how to fracture all these meshes. So let's take the floor bottom, the floor mid, and the floor top, and move this to a new collection called floors. And each of these meshes have different number of floors. So let's select all of these and let's start isolating each of these floors. So let's get into edit mode and let's separate. And before we do any selection, let's turn the X-ray mode on so we can select all the vertices. And let's select and separate by selection. So this floor has been separated into its own mesh. And let's repeat the procedure for each of these floors. There we go. So we have all these floors separated. The 5 floors from the top are separated into 5 different meshes. So let's do the same thing for the midsection of these floors as well. Okay. So these are all the midsection floors. And let's do the same thing for the bottom floors as well. So now we have all of these floors separated. So let's add a scatter to each of these floor meshes. So let's add a standard scatter and let's work with the low scatter density of 100. And in order to visualize the points, there we go. So these are the points on each of these floors and accept. And let's use a max chunks of 100. The fractured chunks of all of these floors are going to go into a single target collection. And that's what we want here. So let's name that collection as floors underscore TC. TC is just for target collection. Perfect. And before we fracture, let's toggle the system console just to see what's happening. And let's fracture. Perfect. Let's use auto smooth by checking on this auto smooth checkbox. And as we can see, the fracture is good, but there are some bad chunks here. And this happens when the mesh is manifold, still there are few intersect faces, right? So those problems in the mesh will lead to all of these bad chunks. So let's see how to fix them. So we can actually select each of these bad chunks manually by inspecting the mesh. So the way we do that is by checking this in pre-selection box, and then we can go to each of these chunks and then click on auto fix. So it's going to auto fix these chunks, but this is going to take quite some time to check all of these manually. So instead, what we'll do is we'll deselect this in pre-selection checkbox, and then let the add-on do an auto selection. So we click on select bad chunks, and it's going to go through each of these chunks and then select all of these bad chunks. And this is going to take some time. So please don't think that Blender has frozen or anything. It's just that it goes through each of these chunks and there are thousands of chunks to inspect. So it's going to take a while. There we go. It selected all the bad chunks. Now before clicking on anything else, since all of these are selected, let's click on Auto Fix. There we go. So all of the bad chunks have been fixed. And before we apply fractures, we also have an option to add extra details. Since there are many chunks here, let's explore this option on a different mesh later in this tutorial. So for now, let's apply the fractures with the low resolution detail for the floors. All the fractures have been applied. Cool. Now let's take the large profile, which is this mesh, and let's work on it. Let's move this to a new collection. And let's also move the bottom profile into the same collection. Let's actually rename this as profiles, large, bottom. Right, let's take these two meshes and let's add a standard scatter. So it adds a density of 100 to each of these meshes. And the density seems to be a little low, so let's add a density of 200. And then accept. And the max chunks for each mesh at 200. And let's select a single output and name it profiles. And let's fracture. Perfect. Let's turn on auto smooth. And there we go. To these meshes, let's see how to add extra detail. Now, if we take a closer look at each of these meshes, there's no inner detail. Inner details are pretty much flat. So let's add extra details. And we have a couple of options here, the remesh option and the subdivision option. Let's add a subdivision option to it. And if we take a chunk, let's increase the subdivisions to 2. And we are working with the profiles large bottom target collection. And there we go. We can actually see the detail being added. But the more detail we add, the more computation it's going to take. Now in this scenario, since the mesh has no issues, it was a manifold mesh and there were no intersect faces for this mesh, if you recall from the previous tutorial. So that's the reason why we don't have any bad meshes. But it's always good to just check if there are any. So let's deselect the pre-selection and then just select bad chunks. And as we guessed, there aren't any bad chunks, which is good. So now we can apply the fractures. Perfect. The fractures have been applied. As we can see, it's flat inside. What happened to all the details? Now, in order to work with greater efficiency in the viewport, we have an option here where it automatically switches all of these chunks to a low detail version in the viewport. In order to check, we can actually select the high detail version, and we will be able to see the high detail version here. There we go. There we go. For now, let's work with the low detail version because it's much easier on the viewport. Now let's work on the frames. Let's select all of these frames. And then let's move them to their own collection and let's rename it frames. So these are all the frames. Now here, in order to have an even distribution of points, let's get into edit mode and let's select all of these vertices and then separate by loose parts. Now this is gonna separate the mesh into all of these separate meshes. So each of these is an individual object. Perfect. Now let's select all of these meshes. There are about 1798 objects. And let's add a standard scatter. Now since there are many of these objects, we don't need such high scatter density. So let's just break each of these profiles into 2 chunks. So let's add a scatter density of 2 for each of these profiles. If we need more chunks, we can add more scatter density as well. But for now, let's keep it at 2 and accept. And then also the max chunks for each of these profiles, let's keep it at 2. And then for the single output option, let's select frames and hit fracture. Now this is going to take a while. It's going to go through each of these meshes and then run the fracture algorithm. All right, it took about 45 minutes. So all of these fractures look good. Even though there are a few intersecting faces, the fractures actually look good. So let's apply the fractures. Perfect. Now let's work on the glass. Let's move all of these glasses to a new collection, and let's rename them as glass. And here again, if we see, the bottom glass has 3 structures and the mid glass has probably 20 some structures. So let's select these 3 meshes and let's tab into edit mode, select all, and then let's separate by loose parts. Perfect. So that way, each of these glass meshes is going to be a separate object. And let's add a standard scatter. And let's increase the density to 100. Actually looks good. Accept. And the max chunks to 100. And then let's click on the single output and then rename it as class target collection. And let's fracture. Right. Let's add auto smooth. Perfect. These glass meshes were also manifold with the no intersecting faces, so there shouldn't be any bad chunks. And it appears they don't have any bad chunks, which is good. Looks good. Perfect. Let's apply the fractures as well. Perfect. Now as the scene is getting heavier, we can see the viewport performance is decreasing. Now let's select the mid profile and then move it to separate collection. And let's get into edit mode and select all and then separate by loose parts. There we go. So all of these meshes are separate objects. Now let's add a standard scatter. And let's add a scatter density of 100. And let's get all of them to a single output and let's rename them as profiles dot mid underscore tc, and let's fracture them. Let's enable auto smooth. Perfect. So it's always better to have non-intersecting faces, but if the meshes are complicated, it's always not possible. So this actually looks very good. Perfect. Let's apply the fracture. Perfect. So the entire building has been fractured, and there's one more mesh left, which is the floor.ground. And let's make that a passive object. And the way we do that is let's get into this motion module and then let's click on set RBD and then let's change the type from active to passive. So now this is going to be a passive object. Perfect. So now the entire building is ready. So these are all the target collections that we have. So the floors, the profiles, the large profiles, the frames, the glass, and the mid profiles. So in the next tutorial, let's use the rigid body module to add rigid bodies to this collection, and let's do a basic destruction. Thank you and stay tuned.